Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Good. Okay. So welcome to Korean Studies Seminar Series, and I hope everyone is having a great uh, start of the semester. As many of you already know that we, NU Korean Studies Center, organizes and presents seminars and K-Talks series on a monthly basis. And this is one of our first seminar session of the semester. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Junhee Park or Jun Park. She's also a good friend of mine since I don't know 1999 or 2000, so it's almost 22 decades now. Dr. Park specializes political economy, and she writes on various topics, include trade, energy, and technology, and conflict and legal issues pertaining to those areas. She was also selected for the Next Generation Scholar, funded by National Research Foundation of Korea, which is equivalent to US NSF, for 2019 and 2020 years. And she also published many papers and articles about analyzing government policies and in major academic journals like World Development and Asian Perspective and so on. And prior to her current position, she is currently a research fellow at George Washington University. Prior to the current position, she also held several academic and as well as professional positions, including the fellowship at the Lee Kuan Yew School of National University of Singapore. And she was also a consultant for American University of Beirut. And she was also contributing to major media outlets like a BBC, Al Jazeera, and IT, and Le Figaro. So today she will present her very recently published book chapter in an edited volume, which is right behind my on the chair behind me, titled Coronavirus Politics. So as you can imagine from the title, it's very interesting and very timely volume, I guess. I haven't looked the entire chapters yet, but I look forward to reading it. It's about the politics and policies about COVID-19 around the world. So it's more like a comparative policy analysis, I guess. So finally, before I hand it over to our guest speaker, so let me clarify some of our rules in the house. So please turn off your audio while she's presenting her presentation, because multiple audios sometimes cause problems and make her voices less audible. And second, if you have any questions, please leave your questions on the chat window, but make sure that you're writing to everyone so all of us can be on the same page when we proceed to the Q&A session following her presentation. And third, the recording of today's seminar will be posted on our YouTube channel. Yes, we have YouTube channel, so you can look up Nazarbayev University Korean Studies Center in YouTube and you will find us easily. The video will be available and open to public for a 1 week period, and then after that we will close it. But if you need to access and want to watch the video again, you have to please contact us to our email, koreanstudies@nu.edu.kz. And then I will ask for permission from Dr. Park, and then I will share you or grant you extended access to the video. Okay, so please welcome everyone. Welcome Dr. Jun Park and Jun. The floor is yours now.
Okay, I've unmuted myself. Thank you. My greatest appreciation to Dr. Ko and the Korea Studies Center at Nazarbayev University. I've never been to Kazakhstan, and this is probably my first opportunity to actually be there, albeit in virtual form. And welcome to those of you who have joined the seminar who are in interest of these topics that are evolving as we speak. Actually, this afternoon, the editor sent final edits for the third time for the chapter. And, you know, this book has roughly around 30 countries in total, sharing various experiences and analyses on how each country dealt with what, it encompassing many countries in Europe, Central European countries, Western, Northern, even in the Middle East, the US, and several Asian countries that have performed fairly well during this pandemic, aside from some of the faulty mistakes that we've seen around the world. So what I'd like to suggest for this particular seminar is some of the findings that I put into this book. They are a little bit in overlaps with my previous World Development article, and the major findings from the World Development article shine through in the first part of the chapter, which is on social and health policies, public health policies. I think that would be most interesting to most of the Kazakh students in Kazakhstan, because just from hearing before our session from Dr. Ko, it looks like not much public and governmental liaisons are being made through media or information conveyance in the form that South Korea is experiencing right now, which is actually the main thing that gets us going at the moment. And there is the second section in the chapter, which is on economic policies, which is mainly about granting funds to small and medium-sized enterprises or small shop owners. There is a lot to be desired in this particular area, and the slides do not reflect all of what I've said on economic policies. So what I'd like to suggest is to briefly go over the public health policies and the social policies involving quarantine, a little bit of vaccination, but most of all, how to control the virus when it first came about. So let me just start with these slides. And perhaps most of you would know how South Korea detected the virus on January 20th, so that's roughly about a year ago, in Incheon from a patient from Wuhan, patient 0 from Wuhan. And some of the things that the foreign audience fails to understand is the previous experience of MERS and how that changed all of the institutional backgrounds in South Korea, especially the Infectious Disease Control, Prevention and Control Act. So let us go through one by one what kind of characteristics shine through in terms of the Korean experience in COVID-19. Okay, so let me try to do full screen here. How do you do? Where do you go here on the full screen? Six lines, view, full screen. Am I in full screen mode at the moment? No. Right? Full screen. Okay, for some reason, this is not responding as I would want it to. So the research question that I have here for you is, how can political elites learn from the past to enhance sustainability of their leadership in a pandemic situation? The general elections was a testing board for South Korea to seek how much public demand there was politically in order to overcome the crisis. And if you compare South Korea's experience to those of, say, Germany or France, the leadership that was demonstrated through the crisis revealed how important the control tower is and how important the institutional measures that were in place, continuously revised, were important and crucial in controlling the virus. The conceptual framework that I've used in the World Development article is looking at how public and private partnership actually worked in terms of having the lessons learned from MERS, and then utilizing this during time two, which is COVID-19. In terms of the real-time PCR testing that most of you are very familiar with at the moment right now, the PCR tests were developed using algorithms, AI algorithms by one of the companies, Seijin, specifically used those kits to be developed in a very, very rapid form. Later, it was bolstered in terms of speed of development by Samsung, the smart factory system assisted by Samsung Electronics. So all of those PPT developments came about because, unlike in the US, there was the control tower endowed to the Ministry of Health and Welfare. Later, there were some bureaucratic ups and downs when the current Korea Centers for Disease Control is now an independent agency, but is still working in consortium with the Ministry of Health and Welfare. Basically, the big difference that Korea had was that the experts' opinions were respected. Although in the later phase of the pandemic, which was during the third wave, some of the measures that the experts recommended were not fully reinstated in terms of actual policy implementation. So there were some disappointing moments in terms of the structure later on in the third wave. But in the earlier phase of the pandemic, this actually worked. So the argument that I had in the World Development article, as well as the Coronavirus Politics book chapter, was that the leaderships are very much beholden to the performance in the pandemic. And the RT-PCR test kit development and the dissemination case is a very, very crucial attestament to that. So this is MERS in 2015. What happened at the time was KCDC having only the sole control of administering RT-PCR testing, not unlike what we have now in South Korea, where every district has a testing site or health-related offices within hospitals, public or private, that are able to gain through various routes through the KCDA these RT-PCR test kits. So at the time, only KCDA, now KCDA, KCDC, now KCDA, was able to administer these kits. And that changed in the aftermath of MERS. So the kinds of changes that came about after MERS was the revision of the Infectious Disease Prevention and Control Act. That allowed for testing, that allowed for collecting data in terms of GPS data, credit card information data, also a little bit of CCTV footage, but that's not the central feature here. The main data that's collected is GPS data in South Korea. And then the communications to the public would be on a very, very frequent basis, regularly held at the KCDA headquarters through KTV. And most of all, the emergency use authorization here in number 2, regulatory framework, the emergency use authorization through the KCDA and the MSDS, which is Shigekso, Ministry of Food and Drug Safety. So those public-private partnerships that were so crucial to controlling the pandemic is where the responses from foreign media or foreign scholars, they were at awe of how this actually works. Say, for example, in the United States, this wouldn't be possible without some of the lobbying that has been continuing, big pharma lobbying in the Congress because of their globally influential industrial power that they possess throughout the world. Whereas South Korea's pharmaceutical industry is still a little bit in the leapfrogging stage and needs to collaborate with the government in order to extend a little bit more. So I would say that the implementation of this kind of model that South Korea manifested in the crisis would be applicable to countries that have a leapfrogging pharmaceutical industry, but not in the cases of, say, the United States, where pharmaceutical evolution has been advancing for so long, and they have considerable power in terms of lobbying in Washington. So these are some of the changes, legal text changes that came about after MERS and then during COVID-19. And what's so crucial here is that the access to patient data and the control tower's obligation, as well as the right to actually administer the things that they would need to do in terms of controlling the pandemic, is all there. This was done through a fast track under Moon Jae-in before the general elections, because I think the incumbents were very, very afraid they would lose the election if they didn't do that. And emergency use authorization, that changed. The major trait here is that the large-scale testing was made available, unlike during MERS, because the law, the revised IDPCA law, enables large-scale dissemination of these products and of the kits and the administering of the kits. So this is how the RT-PCR testing actually functions. Not only the KCDC, but public and private hospitals in general would be able to access and administer the test. And that's how testing was done in South Korea. These are some of the in vitro diagnostics. In vitro means well, inside the little cup. It's not for the human body, but in vitro, the people cup. These companies have been at this for about 20 years, and not all of them are listed on the Korea Exchange, Korea Stock Exchange, but some of them are expecting to be listed there. And what's really important here is that these companies that have been working on these technologies, they're also continuing to thrive with the advent of AI. So AI algorithms are used in order to detect what kind of viruses there are up on the horizon. So, for example, when Seagen developed it, it was even before the patient zero happened in South Korea. So, for example, even before the discovery of patient zero in South Korea, what happened was Seagen obtained the DNA and RNA information from the WHO website, and they ran an algorithm to come up with a real-time PCR test kit, and that was very successful. It was even featured on CNN. And many of them went on to apply for EUA from the US FDA and also the European Food and Drug Administration, and they were quite successful. Not all of these test kits were, I think all of them were approved by the US FDA, but not vice versa, as you see here. And later on, when the third wave happened, it's not in the text that I've written for the book chapter per se, but later on, the KCDA also approved an antibody testing kit, which does not have as high as the accuracy rate as these RT-PCR test kits, but because there would be storms, like a deluge of infection cases, the KCDA allowed for that, and one company was given an EUA. And we witnessed something that was really drastic, never seen before in terms of customs, in terms of exports. It just skyrocketed. A lot of countries around the world purchased these test kits. These are the countries that wanted to get the RT-PCR test kits from South Korea. Now the market has died, and there's kind of more competition from other countries around the world that have developed these test kits. So if you go for your next test in Kazakhstan or wherever you are in the world, you'll likely see non-Korean test kits as well, because now there are plenty more. What's crucial in this graphic here, this is from our world in data, South Korea started massive tests earlier on in the pandemic, as you see in this graphic, and other countries followed suit without having tested and figuring out where the virus was. South Korea couldn't have flattened the curve earlier on in the pandemic. The problem later on in the third wave was that small and incremental cases were on the rise, depending on communities, depending on human-to-human interactions. But in general, South Koreans behaved fairly well in interest and support of other people. That was a crucial difference, and the wearing of masks, which were mandated starting from August. So not earlier in the pandemic, but from August. This is also a very big deviation from many other countries that had to mandate masks and had plenty of trouble. South Korea did have those troubles as well, but in general, people understood the magnitude of what impact they could bring by wearing the masks on their own. So these are total confirmed deaths. Compared to other countries in Europe or the US, this is quite a significant difference. The number of deaths were on the spike during the third wave. There were days when up to 40 deaths were confirmed per day, and that was probably the biggest figures that we have ever encountered. But if you compare this to other populations, you would see that South Korea is managing fairly well. And these are some public evaluations. This shows how much political demand there is toward the leadership. In order to control the pandemic, people want to be safe. People don't want their lives to be destroyed by the pandemic. And these are shown through the Gallup data throughout MERS and also COVID-19. So the voter turnout cannot be disassociated from the pandemic governance results, the voter turnout in April, because basically at the time, the Moon Jae-in administration had a very, very low approval rating, as they do now. Right now, I think it's more about having to do with real estate policies. But back then, it was more than that. It was about the failure of foreign policy. It was also about failure in the job market, generating jobs for the younger and the elderly. And in general, it was just considered a complete catastrophe at the time. And then pandemic governance results. So people chose to go with what was safe. And so policy implications wise, here, the public health policy wise, pandemic governance decides the fate of leadership is the actual finding here. But I'd like to go on and discuss a little bit more with regard to data. So maybe I should I'll just open a different presentation just for your interest, which is really important in order to understand how South Korea, the case of South Korea is different from what is seen in Europe. So just one more minute on the data issue, and then we will open it up for questions. Okay, so let me newly share. Let me newly share this specific slide. Okay. So this is another piece of work that I'm currently completing at the moment with regard to data. And what I'd like to point out here is into the future, we probably have to deal with how vaccination results are reflected in our passports, but we also probably have to deal with how in the contactless economy, we will be able to do things in terms of transactions. So here, the main question that we're dealing with in this research project is whether GPS data should be used for emergencies or not. And in Europe, because of the General Data Protection Regulation, it's coined as GDPR, which went into effect from 2018, the use of data, the GPS data is considered personal information to the extent that it's part of your body, of the natural person. And as you probably saw in the text revisions of IDA-PCA, in South Korea, under extreme pandemic situations, the government is allowed to collect this data and to use it, which is considered illegal currently in Europe and also in the United States. In California, they were able to roll out TA Notify, and the app does not use GPS data. The participants can use the data not on a mandatory basis, but only on a voluntary basis. And compared to the South Korean tracking method, the US and European countries were not able to benefit from such technology. So I'll just end with this specific slide, and we can open it up for questions, and we can discuss more if you'd like. So what was really crucial in terms of each country going in their own direction with regard to corona tracking was we would give in our data to private companies, but we would never give in to government. And that was what was really striking for me in looking at the European behavior, European countries' behavior, because none of the countries wanted to go for a centralized method. The Italians had a little bit of there was a little bit of subject matter involving the violation of perhaps Article 22 of GDPR, but on Article 6, every country that I've seen as an object of this study, they abided by the GDPR. And later on in July, the Council of Europe, they started to discuss whether in terms of emergencies, they should allow for GPS data usage by the government and also by the private companies. Because the apps that they released, they were not being downloaded as they should, and the system in which they were making this function, it was unbelievably ineffective because basically every person in the population should have had a cell phone, a gadget, and downloaded, active, in order for this to work, in order for the pseudonymized tracking method to work. But not only is the public opinion against these kinds of internet digitalization in Europe, they are not open to the idea of data collection for the purpose of public health safety. So I think that's the biggest difference between what was seen in South Korea and Europe, and also the United States. So I'll leave it there, and we can open it up for more further in-depth questions. If you have any questions, I would be delighted to answer them.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jun Park. Please leave any questions you want to ask about how about South Korea's fighting COVID-19. You can leave your questions on the chat window so that everyone can read and see the question as Dr. Park addresses those questions. But if you prefer to speak to her in person, that's also fine. So please, well, you can raise your hands or um, whatever convenient for you. So I can see that you have a question.
Nobody has a question.
I just have one question, if I may. I think it's better speaking. Yeah, it's just a question out of curiosity. Yes, the institutions matter. Everything matters. But I was wondering, what is the role of society in kind of combating this COVID? Because I mean, we've had a lot of discussions here in Kazakhstan back in May, June, July, and then in Europe, a lot of is being said about the situation when people just normally do not follow the regulations that government kind of offers, not wearing masks, not gathering, in big groups and this kind of things. What is the role of society? How this societal norms that existed in South Korea affected this more or less a successful policy?
Right, you raised an important point there with regard to mandating things such as mask wearing on public transport or in public venues, or not allowing more than 5 people gather at a specific venue if you are from various different registered residential areas. So I think what mattered in general, the South Korean citizens are more or less open to the idea of wearing masks. I think that's a big, big difference from, say, Europe. But without the penalties that are in place in order to enforce, South Korea could not have achieved what it has right now, because, say, for example, every evening in the news, you can find cases of violation of these mandated guidelines. Even if they are mandated, people choose to opt out, behave outside the regulatory framework. And there is, in fact, specifically a specific punitive fee, violation fee that comes after them, that are charged on them if they are found in violation and they result in infectious acts. So earlier on in the pandemic, what happened was many Koreans living abroad coming home to flee the virus and being caught in several different manners, and they would be sued through the Korea Police Agency. And while in the foreign media it was reflected, it was portrayed as something draconian, say, as in the case of maybe the Chinese practice. But what was perceived here was not exactly like that. It's about being irresponsible and being, against the law, because the IDCPA is precisely revised at the National Assembly in order to control the virus. That's the fact. People understand that this law, this is for the public health safety. And that's a big, big start to begin with, because if you don't have public adherence to the law, I mean, having some glitches here and there because some people don't follow the law, then, that's, if you don't have such a law, then things can get pretty out of hand, as you've seen in protests elsewhere. Say in Brazil, even the president acted very carelessly in terms of, the infection itself. I think the previous experience of mayors really, really educated the public in terms of what this virus actually is. And that's why you would see less vaccine hesitancy in South Korea when it's rolled out next month. In France, less than 30% of the French public would want to be vaccinated. And that's a very big difference because the social discourse against this pandemic in Korea is a lot more toward ending it as soon as possible than again compared to other nations. I have friends here at the Foreign Press Club that keep on sharing their anecdotes with friends, and it seems like in several different countries it's considered just as a cold when it's not. It's a serious virus that could destroy an entire family. And I think, you know, the social concept of being careless differs based on the jurisdiction because there are different laws or there are no laws.
Okay, just a brief, quick follow-up, if I may. So is it about more about punishment from the government if you don't follow regulations, or is it more about trust in the government, what government says and what government does? So what prevails, or is it a combination of both?
I don't think the South Korean public are cheerleaders for this incumbent, you know, whoever is seated in the Blue House, they're not cheerleaders for that specific leader, but what they are in for is the trust in the public health officials, what the guidance. So it's very important in South Korea, for South Korea to not mess this up politically from this point forward until the pandemic ends. It's important not to associate this with politics as it happened during the Trump presidency, say, for example, where Dr. Fauci would be put in the back and then called up front and then put in the back. Things like that should not happen here. The public health officials should be given full authority in order to implement this. Otherwise, you just lose trust in the expertise of the public health officials. And in many countries, because public health systems were not really catered to address infectious diseases per se, just look at Japan, for example. Japan does not have a CDC, and the Ministry of Health and Welfare exists, and Koze is only taking this up as much as they can within their own boundaries. They are continuously in consultation with other ministries, but here in South Korea, the law enables the Ministry of Health and Welfare to be at the top and the KCDA to be at the top. Without the law mandating these officials of their obligations and rights, it wouldn't be easy to administer all of these tasks. More questions? Or are we just
yeah, just following up Johnny Beck's question and what Dr. Park just mentioned. So I want to cite one of the public survey results in South Korea during the pandemic. So there are two things are, I think, relevant and interesting to our topic. So first of all, South Korean public have indicated high level of trust in governments dealing with the virus, and also the experts and the health experts and health related administrations. But on the other side, this increase of trust does not lead to the increase of the general trust. So meaning people do not generally trust other people in South Korea. Well, in fact, yes, in fact, the corona situation decreases this public or general trust because, you know, everyone can be, you know, there's a source of infection or could be spreading, yeah. But they trust the public dealing with this situation, but it's kind of ironic or I don't know, it's a paradoxical. So people tend to be more cautious about each other, but they put more trust in the government dealing with the virus.
I think that's a very unique finding, and it's very reflective of the realities here. People put more trust than I've ever seen in governmental efforts, the public health authorities. Well, I guess you would say because there is not full-fledged financial support for small and medium-sized enterprises, if you compare the magnitude of funds put in to support these people, say in Germany, you wouldn't be able to, fathom the kinds of possibilities for revival, with the funding that the Korean government is giving out for these people right now. There is almost no chance they would recover even next year because they haven't been able to continue on with their businesses for more than now 1 year. And if you look at the funding schemes by Germany, it's a lot more generous and it gives more possibilities of revival and rejuvenation in the aftermath of the pandemic or during the pandemic. But here, much has been fixated on just getting the figures down. And I think there's been a lot of clashes between the Ministry of Strategy and Finance, Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Health and Welfare. But that's the government side of the story. What is particular about this specific finding is that people have been growing more and more apart from each other because they know they can be the cause of infection. They themselves can be the cause of infection, but at the same time, they don't want to be associated with other kinds of infection from a different community or anyone that you come across. And, there's also this component, which I find culturally very, very vexing. If you don't have a mask on, it's like you're a terrorist on the street. And there was this one time when I was on a village bus and somebody attempted to, get on the bus without wearing a mask. Oh gosh, the response was just, out of this world. The driver, the people seated, don't even think about getting on board, And those kinds of things, they worry me somewhat because even after vaccination, what is told by the public health authorities is that you should wear a mask. You should keep the social distancing patterns as practiced as now. And what would happen likely is we get used to this. We get used to being apart from each other, and that becomes the norm. And that would inevitably decrease the level of social capital. And I think that's happening now in Korea, but industries that are in for this business, for contactless, they're very excited because they can make money out of this. Any other questions? Compared to the European students, so I delivered the data presentation to one of my friends' class in Rome, and they were up in arms about data collection. They were like, what if the stuff that happens with the French police happens in Rome? What if they take away all of our data? What if we're used as puppets? And I think the experience is really what, sets us apart. In Korea's case, it's more about the previous pandemic experience. Well, it wasn't a pandemic by the WHO guidelines, but it was indeed a globally infectious disease, MERS. And Korea had 38 deaths. That was the highest of outside the Middle East, anywhere outside the Middle East. But in the case of Europe, it's been about 100 years since they ever had these kinds of an epidemic. Ebola was mainly contained in Africa. It didn't really come on to North America or Europe, but South Korea went through this fairly recently. So I think that's really what sets them apart. You know, other economies that are struggling right now, as opposed to South Korea. Although South Korea thinks, the general population thinks this is a very dire situation. No questions.
Yeah, sorry, I was writing a question on the chat, but I think it's faster to just speak to you.
Okay.
So, yeah, so the experience of MERS in 2015 was kind of a, yeah, as a big impact on the current situation, the current government dealing the situation. Um, so I think one of the key characteristic is Korean government is kind of like a mixture of a twofold approach to the situation. So one side is they have a very strong government governance of the pandemic. So they collect all the personal data. They have strong centralized control tower. But at the same time, government, I remember the South Korean government didn't shut down its border. And trying to keep or maintain its connection to outside world. So it's kind of a interesting given this experience of MERS, which comes from the Middle East, but South Korea resist of the idea of shutting down the border. So what would be the main rationale behind this twofold approach to the situation? And well, since other countries has no such experience of MERS, except for a few countries in Middle East and Asia, so what would be European and American response if they, I mean, after this COVID-19, would they shut down their border more frequently and strongly, or would they follow, let's say, South Korean model of, this dual approach?
I think that's a very interesting question, because one of the things that I personally had as a rejection in my mind was how the government was dealing with the border issue. And if you look at the success cases of Taiwan and New Zealand, they shut down earlier on, and look at them right now. They're able to go about their businesses and whatnot. As a political economist, I think, because I always talk about trade or read about trade, etc., the reliance that South Korea has on other economies and the willingness to continue such economic interactions, I think that was quite vital in not closing down the border, but also what politically is discussed in the general media with regard to China. Not shutting down borders because specifically on China. I think that also played a big part for the Blue House decision not to close the borders. In the European case, I think the Schengen area generally, so it is not completely true that European countries were not able to go places. It was just more stricter. But when it comes to lockdown, which South Korea never really had, the serious lockdown that is implemented in Europe, that never happened here. So that was possible because the tracking system in South Korea actually was legal. In Europe, that wouldn't be legal. So I guess the different paths that countries choose to take on, depending on what they think is right, what they think they can allow, is probably what sets apart these practices. But on the border issue, in the beginning, I was for the opinion that South Korea should shut its borders. And then gradually, when there were cases from abroad, when the numbers from cases abroad soared, people were against the idea of allowing for returnees or paying for their treatment. So the law changed, and I mentioned this in the book chapter. Sometime along the way, sometime in, I think, August, the government reversed its plan, the already existing measures of free treatment to foreigners, and changed the policy based on reciprocity, meaning if Korean citizens are treated for free in that part of that country, then South Korea also treats the patients of that country for free here, because there was so much backlash when there were a swarm of Russian fishermen coming into Busan and not being required to pay for their hospital fees, and that was incurring a huge loss in terms of tax, South Korean tax money. So I guess into the future, it would be more based on reciprocity. And I guess the long-term benefits of this is that because you never close down, you're going to be expected to be welcomed because you never close down. But there is of course the side effect from that is that you still have to contain the virus coming from outside, and that's like, you know, it's an external effect, as you would say in economics, external effect that you have to take on because you chose to go that path. And sincerely, I think you know, had we closed down, it would have been better. But because a year has passed since then, and you know, people just want to go about their trading practices, it's not going to change.
Thank you. Anyone has any other questions? Okay. So, Jun, do you see the question on the chat?
Yes. What is 녹색 인간? You're not helping me. Exactly right. So this is an interesting term, green human. I am more or less in agreement with these kinds of projections that you will not be able to travel freely, and you will be traced, yes. And that's why when the contactless economy evolves and thrives, then the populations that are outside the jurisdiction where these technologies are adopted, they will be marginalized. They would become the third world. And so the challenges of this is that you are making the richer part of the world richer and the poorer part of the world poorer, because it is highly likely that no investment would actually go into these countries for developing the contactless economy as we see here developing here or in other parts of the US or even China. And because you know, vaccine passports are underway, it's highly likely that the travel experiences that we've had since 1999, you know, experiencing the world and traveling as we wanted, it would not be feasible anymore unless you prove yourself to be virus free. And that's a sad thing, because previously, when there were, even if you carried other diseases, even if you had pre-existing diseases, then you would still be able to travel based on the fact that you would have all of your immunizations, right? And I hope that in the future, the variants of the virus will not cause us to give up on travel and international exchanges, or the development of further vaccines would help us to deter that. Because at this rate, it seems like this green human idea is very, very plausible. And countries are going to be locking up borders against people who are being to bring in the virus in some form. And this has not been said, but I think the vaccine passports will become a reality pretty soon. No other questions?
Okay, so so any other questions? So it's been an hour already, I think. Uh, well, I guess there should be a more and more questions coming up as we move on, this to this post-COVID era. So as the previous question mentioned, so maybe there are some kind of a huge inequality, not just about the wealth, but also about health, right? And also
Yeah.
between countries. So, Dr. Park, you mentioned there is a reciprocity is expected. So if your people is treated in my country, then my people are also treated in your country, and so on. But countries, we, as we eh, as we all know, the country have different, healthcare system and different levels of medical technologies and so on. So they may have some, impacts negatively as well as positively. So it could be even worse than the race to the bottom of the globalization,
Oh,
or even not just between countries, but also between individuals and so on. So I guess you should write another chapter about the future of the COVID-19,
rising
post-COVID-19.
inequality. Right. So for now, I think the data governance, dairy data governance that causes inequality is my main interest for the moment. But later on, when the vaccine rollouts are administered throughout the world, uh, I'm looking at this COVAX facility, um, which is governed by Gavi, and it's a WHO sponsored kind of a platform, but the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also supports it. It's a system of 75 countries that are members that can obtain the vaccine, you know, based on the contracts that they seal with these companies, pharmaceutical companies. But even there is no guarantee that it's a system that would guarantee access to vaccines in an equal manner. And inoculating all of the people in different parts of the world, I think that would be almost a 10-year agenda. Even if these companies continue to produce and sell, the richer countries would take, the lion's share of the already produced product. As I read yesterday, the U.S. ran out of its supply. So it's a very difficult situation in terms of equality. But it will go on like this for a while, unless there is a different kind of a system or enough people, I guess. It's sad that this happens. And for that reason, I would like to know exactly and how this started.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like the Third World War, where people die, but not from gunshots. They just die from that virus. And even without the virus, people go frail and they just die in their homes because they can't walk outside. It's just, I don't know. It's really sad. It's really a pathogen war. But people fail to realize that it actually is, especially in Europe. I think, it's just gone too much overboard. No, it's just so sad. I guess we have people that are leaving and people are all busy, but I would love to hear other questions that would help me go about this journey. So I'll leave my contact information here if others who would watch this later on want to contact me or have different ideas about their experiences. So please email.
Well, that's great and very generous. So I will disseminate your contact information for those who will watch the recording, and then we'll directly contact you for any questions. So let me just wrap up today's session. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and special thanks to my friend June. So it was really interesting and informative session, I think, and I personally have many questions to ask you, so I actually did. So I look forward to hearing from you again soon with more time and more topics to discuss later on. Um, So thank you, everyone. Since the university is going online once again in this semester, so we are going to organize more online activities. So keep yourself busy and myself busy as well. So as I said earlier at the beginning of today's session, we're going to organize seminars on a monthly basis alongside with our existing talk concert series, K Talks. So K Talks, we have a special guest in February, and she will give us some her own experience of Korea as a foreigner. And for next month, we have another speaker for seminar series, and the topic is about gender politics in South Korea. And also we are organizing a Korean language speaking contest. So stay tuned and pay attention to our announcements. So we're trying to make your semester more vibrant and fun, even though we are only meeting virtually. So again, thank you for everyone. And then thank you, Jin. Okay.